Before we begin, take a moment to slow down. Wherever you are right now, let the noise of the day fade into the background. Tonight's story isn't meant to be rushed. It's meant to be listened to quietly, the way stories used to be shared. Some things arrive too early. Some arrive exactly when we need them. And some arrive when there is nothing left to change. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped halfway through the mail slot like it had hesitated before entering the house. The sound it made was soft, almost apologetic, a thin scrape of paper against metal. It rested on the floor for hours before it was noticed. By the time it was picked up, the afternoon light had already shifted, leaning toward evening. It was addressed in handwriting that felt out of place in a world of printed labels and barcodes. The ink had faded slightly, as if it had traveled farther than it should have. The return address was unfamiliar, written carefully, deliberately, each letter formed with patience. It was the kind of handwriting that suggested someone who believed words mattered. I remember turning the envelope over once, then twice, weighing it in my hand. There was nothing urgent about it. No official stamp. No red markings. Just a name I hadn't seen in years, written as if no time had passed at all. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the house settle around me. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the street, a car door closed. Ordinary sounds, anchoring me in the present, even as the past pressed quietly against the paper between my fingers. I didn't open the letter right away. I set it on the kitchen table and made tea instead, moving slowly, deliberately, as though delay might soften whatever waited inside. Steam rose from the mug and disappeared before reaching the ceiling. I watched it vanish, thinking about how quickly things leave us once they arrive. When I finally sat down, the envelope felt warmer than it should have, as if it had absorbed the heat of the room, or maybe something else entirely. I slid a finger beneath the seal and opened it without tearing the paper. Inside was a single sheet, folded neatly in thirds. The letter began without greeting. It spoke of weather first, of how the winters had grown longer, how the mornings felt quieter now. It mentioned a tree that used to stand near the old bus stop, one I remembered leaning against while waiting for rides that never came on time. The tree had been cut down, the letter said. Progress, they called it. As I read, memories surfaced without asking permission. A shared bench, a conversation that had ended too soon, a promise that hadn't been broken, so much as left unattended. The letter moved carefully through these moments, never naming them directly, but allowing them space to breathe. There was no accusation in the words, no bitterness, only an undercurrent of restraint, like someone choosing each sentence with care, afraid of saying too much or too little. It was the kind of writing that suggested the author had revised it many times, maybe over years, before finally letting it go. Halfway through, the letter paused, as if gathering itself. It spoke then of distance, of how life had unfolded in ways neither of us could have predicted, of decisions made quickly and others postponed until they became decisions in themselves. It acknowledged the silence that had grown between us, not as a failure, but as something that had happened gradually, the way dusk replaces afternoon. I felt something tighten in my chest as I read on. The room seemed smaller, quieter, as though the walls were leaning in to listen. The letter was not asking for anything. It wasn't seeking forgiveness or reconciliation. It was simply speaking, finally, after a long and careful wait. Near the end, the handwriting shifted slightly, growing less precise. The sentences shortened. The margins narrowed. It was here the letter revealed its reason for being written at all. It said there were things that needed to be said before time made them impossible. That words left unspoken have a way of hardening into regret. that writing them down was the only way left to keep them from disappearing completely. The final lines were brief. They said they hoped this letter would reach me at the right moment, that if it didn't, at least the words had been sent. At least they had tried. I folded the paper slowly and placed it back into the envelope. Outside, the sky had darkened, the light thinning into evening. I sat there for a long time after, listening to the quiet, holding a message that had crossed years to reach me, wondering what moment it had been meant for, and what it might mean that it had arrived now. The house breathed around me, patient and still, as though it knew this was only the beginning, and that the rest of the story had yet to unfold. I didn't sleep much that night. The letter stayed on the kitchen table, exactly where I had left it, as if moving it might change what it contained. Every time I closed my eyes, fragments of sentences surfaced, not the words themselves, but the spaces between them, the pauses, the restraint, the careful way it had avoided saying the one thing I felt it was circling. Morning arrived quietly. Pale light crept through the curtains, touching the edges of the room without commitment. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching a neighbor walk their dog, the leash loose, unhurried. The world continued, unaware of the small shift that had taken place inside my house. I carried the letter with me through the day without realizing it, folded into a jacket pocket, set beside me at the table while I ate lunch I couldn't taste. It felt strange how something so light could carry such weight, how a single page could pull so much of the past into the present. It had been years since I last heard that handwriting speak to me. We hadn't ended badly. That was the problem. There had been no final argument, no moment dramatic enough to justify the silence that followed. Life had simply stepped in between us, filling the space with obligations, with new addresses, with reasons that sounded reasonable at the time. I thought back to the last conversation we'd had. It was brief, practical. We spoke about schedules, about timing, about how we would talk soon. We meant it. I know we did. But soon became later, and later became something easier not to confront. The letter, now reopened, seemed different in daylight. Less mysterious, more human. I noticed small details I'd missed before. A smudge near the edge of the paper. A place where the pen had paused too long, leaving a darker mark. Evidence of hesitation, of doubt. Midway through the afternoon, I noticed the postmark. It was old, older than it should have been. I traced the date with my thumb, reading it again to be sure. The letter hadn't arrived late by a day or two. It had arrived years late. The realization settled slowly, not with shock, but with a quiet heaviness that spread outward from my chest. This letter had been written in a different version of the world, in a time when things might still have been said aloud, when choices were still open. Questions followed, one after another. Where had it been all this time? Lost in a sorting facility, misplaced in a drawer, forgotten on purpose or by accident. None of the answers felt satisfying. None of them changed what mattered. The letter had been sent with hope. That much was clear. Hope that it would land while time still had flexibility. Hope that it might start a conversation instead of closing one. I sat back and let the room grow quiet again. Somewhere in the distance, a siren passed and faded. The clock on the wall marked time steadily, indifferent to the weight I was placing on each minute. I wondered what might have happened if the letter had arrived when it was supposed to. Would I have called immediately? Would I have waited, rehearsing responses in my head? Would it have changed anything at all? Or would it simply have confirmed what we both already sensed but couldn't articulate? There was a phone number written at the bottom of the page. I hadn't noticed it the first time. It was small, almost an afterthought, written lighter than the rest of the text. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the strange tension of possibility and finality existing side by side. Calling now felt wrong, too late in a way that couldn't be undone. Whatever moment this letter had been meant for had passed quietly, without announcement. Reaching out now would mean creating a new moment entirely, one the letter had never intended. As evening approached, I stepped outside and let the cool air settle around me. The sky was streaked with fading color, the kind that disappears if you look away for even a second. I thought about timing, about how often we assume there will be another chance, another day, another version of ourselves better prepared to speak. Back inside, I placed the letter in a drawer I rarely used, one reserved for things that didn't belong anywhere else. Not forgotten, just kept. I sat in the dim light and listened to the house again. The same sounds as before. The same ordinary world continuing without pause. Yet something had shifted all the same. A door had opened briefly into a past that no longer existed, offering no instructions, only awareness. As the night settled fully around the house, I realized the letter hadn't come to change anything. It had come to remind me of what silence costs. And that realization, quiet as it was, felt like it was preparing me for something still waiting ahead, something the letter itself had only begun to reveal. Days passed, and the letter remained where I had placed it, tucked away but never far from thought. I went through routines with practiced ease, answering emails, returning calls, standing in lines where people shifted impatiently from foot to foot. From the outside, nothing about my days suggested interruption. Inside, something had been gently unsettled. I began noticing how often silence appears disguised as patience, how easily waiting can feel responsible, even kind, until enough time has passed that waiting becomes its own decision. The letter had not accused me of that, but it had illuminated it, the way a dim light reveals dust you didn't know was there. One evening, as rain traced thin lines down the windows, I took the letter out again. I read it slowly, not searching for anything new, but allowing the words to settle the way they were meant to. This time, I noticed how carefully the ending had been written. There was an acceptance woven into it, quiet and steady. Not resignation, understanding. It occurred to me then that the letter hadn't been written in desperation. It had been written in clarity. A moment when the author understood that time moves forward regardless of intention, and that some truths must be released even if no response ever comes back. I thought about the person who had written it, where they might be now, who they had become in the years between sending and arrival. The letter had frozen them in a particular moment, but life rarely stays still long enough to be preserved like that. Whoever they were now existed beyond these words, shaped by events I would never fully know. The phone number at the bottom of the page stayed with me. I traced it again, familiar now, like a path worn by repeated thought. I imagined dialing it, hearing a voice that had changed just enough to remind me of time's passing. I imagined explanations, apologies, conversations that stretched late into the night. And then I imagined nothing happening at all. A disconnected line, a polite stranger answering, silence on the other end that confirmed what the letter had already implied. That some doors, once closed quietly enough, do not reopen the same way. That night, I dreamed of a post office filled with unclaimed letters. Rows and rows of envelopes, each holding words meant for someone who never received them. I woke with the sense that the dream wasn't really about mail, but about all the moments we assume will wait for us. In the morning, I made a decision that surprised me with its calmness. I didn't call, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that the letter had already completed its purpose. It had traveled through time not to restart something, but to settle it gently into place. Instead, I wrote my own letter. I didn't address it to anyone. I wrote it for myself, in the same careful handwriting I rarely used anymore. I wrote about the things I had postponed saying, about how easy it is to confuse silence with kindness, about how love, in all its forms, requires presence more than intention. When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it beside the other letter. Two messages, written in different times, resting together, neither asking anything of the other. Later that afternoon, I walked to the edge of town where the old bus stop used to be. The tree was gone, just as the letter had said. In its place stood a clean, empty space, indistinguishable from any other stretch of pavement. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to traffic pass, feeling the weight of memory settle without resistance. There was sadness there, yes, but also gratitude, for having been known, for having mattered enough to be written to at all. Not everyone receives proof that they once held space in someone else's life. That evening, I placed the letter back into the drawer, not as something unresolved, but as something complete. Some stories don't need answers. They need acknowledgement. And as the house grew quiet once more, I understood that the letter hadn't arrived too late after all. It had arrived exactly when it needed to. Not to change the past, but to shape the way I would speak and listen and show up from this moment forward. Some things cannot be returned, but their meaning can still be carried. And that, I realized, was the true message the letter had been waiting all those years to deliver. And that's where this story ends. Not with answers neatly arranged, but with the quiet understanding that some things stay with us longer than we expect. If this story found you in the late hours, carry it gently. Think about what it left behind, about what was said and what wasn't. Kindly subscribe to this channel, like and share. Thank you for listening. Until next time, rest well.